On June 25, 1983, deep inside Montana's Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, 4-year-old Nyleen Kay Marshall was walking behind two older children along the edge of Maupin Creek when she suddenly vanished. The trail was narrow, the air was calm, and the distance between her and the group was barely half a minute. But in that half minute, she vanished. Not wandered, not hid, vanished. No scream, no struggle, no sound, no footprints in the soft dirt, not a single piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. The forest was silent, too silent for what had just happened. Families panic. Searchers run, but the mountain gives them nothing back. And just when the community was trying to understand how a child could disappear, without leaving even a blade of grass disturbed, a letter arrived, typed, anonymous, untraceable. It was addressed to Child Find of America, and inside it, a man made a claim so shocking investigators remembered exactly where they were standing when they read it. "I have her," the writer said. "She calls me Daddy." The world of this missing child case did not simply darken. It cracked open. He wrote about taking her from the forest, about traveling with her through the United States, about crossing into Mexico, and then Canada. He described bathing her, feeding her, holding her, caring for her. His tone was calm, too calm, possessive, proud, and disturbingly certain that what he was writing was not only true, but justified. But then came the second shock, the part of the letter that made investigators freeze. He began describing private details of Nyleen's disappearance. Details the Marshalls never shared publicly. Details law enforcement intentionally withheld from reporters. Information only someone directly involved in her disappearance, or someone who had access to her, could possibly know. And the letter was not the only communication. There were phone calls too. Calls placed from payphones in Madison, Wisconsin, the same region where the letters were postmarked. Each caller spoke in a flat, steady tone. Never rushed. Never afraid. Never uncertain. He told Child Find that he cared for her. He insisted she was with him by choice. He said she was happy, and that he would never let her go. Investigators chased every payphone, every mailbox, every whisper of this man's shadow. And still, every lead evaporated. Just like Nyleen did. Shock on top of shock. A 4-year-old disappears without a trace. A man claims responsibility. He says she calls him Daddy. He says she travels the continent with him. He knows things he should never know, and he is never found. And so, before the story even begins, before we explore the search, the witnesses, the theories, and the decades of unanswered questions, we must sit with this truth. For more than 4 decades, no one has been able to prove he lied, and no one has been able to prove he told the truth. This is the case of Nyleen Kay Marshall, a child who vanished into an unforgiving forest, and into the hands of a man who may have been watching all along. A case that begins with horror, and only grows darker the deeper you go. If you appreciate careful, respectful, deep-dive true crime investigations, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Crimes Unsealed. Your engagement helps keep these long-forgotten cases alive, and helps bring stories like this back into the light. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Long before the anonymous letters, before the phone calls from distant payphones, before investigators stood speechless in the Montana woods, there was simply a little girl, a child who belonged to a small community, a loving family, and a world that should have kept her safe. Before her name became a headline, Nyleen was simply a shy, bright 4-year-old girl from Anaconda, a child whose laughter made adults soften and whose hand was always tucked carefully inside her mother's. She had the kind of quiet sweetness that made strangers pause. She spoke softly, almost in a whisper. She loved animals, gentle colors, and the comfort of routine. Neighbors remembered her as the little girl who would peek from behind her mother's leg before offering a tiny smile, one of those smiles that felt like sunshine breaking through morning fog. Her mother, Nancy Marshall, often described her as tender-hearted, sensitive, easily frightened by loud noises, but easily delighted by the simplest things. Her father, Kirby Marshall, said she was observant. She noticed birds, tiny rocks by the sidewalk, patterns in the clouds. Nothing escaped her eyes, even though she rarely drew attention to herself. When Nancy later remarried, taking the surname Kay, she still spoke of Nyleen in the present tense, as if her daughter existed in every memory, in every breath, in every hope she refused to let die. For her, Nyleen's story was never a tragedy frozen in time. It was a living wound, a question that never stopped echoing. Friends and family remembered the same things about her gentle nature, her timidity, and her bright curiosity about the world. In reenacted voiceover, one family friend recalls, "She was the kind of child who didn't run to you, she waited for you to come to her. But once she trusted you, she'd hold your hand and not let go." Another adds softly, "She loved her little red jacket. She wore it even when it wasn't cold, because she said it made her feel brave, and that jacket became symbolic. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a shield, a comfort, a little girl's way of feeling confident in a world that often felt too big." She also had a small stuffed animal she adored, a soft, worn rabbit she carried around the house, the kind that loses shape after too much love. She called it Bunny, a name as simple and pure as she was. Nancy once said it was the only thing that eased her daughter's nighttime fear of the dark. These tiny details mattered. They mattered because they reminded people that Nyleen wasn't a case number or a mystery to be solved. She was a real child, with real joys, real fears, and a family who adored her. In Anaconda, a small Montana town where families knew one another, where children played freely between houses, and where Sunday mornings meant greeting familiar faces at church, the news of her disappearance did not feel like something that happened in the world, out there. It felt like the heart of the town had been ripped open. Montana is vast, wide, mountainous, a landscape known for beauty and silence. But when Nyleen vanished, that silence turned cruel. The forest, normally a place families visited for peace, felt suddenly hostile, dangerous, unknowable. People who never met the Marshalls joined the search. Parents held their own children tighter. Church groups prayed together. Strangers left food on Nancy and Kirby's doorstep. The case hit deeply because in Montana, children grow up exploring the outdoors. Creeks, trails, forests, they are part of everyday life. And what happened to Nyleen shattered the belief that this world was safe for children. For years after her disappearance, older residents of Anaconda spoke of her with a mixture of sadness and disbelief. They would say things like, "I remember when she used to wave from the back seat. I remember her tiny voice. I still can't understand how she disappeared like that." To them, she wasn't a mystery. She was a memory that refused to fade. Her mother kept a photograph on the living room wall. A picture of Nyleen, smiling shyly at the camera, her hair parted neatly, her eyes bright and full of trust. In interviews, Nancy said, looking at that picture felt like breathing through glass. She could see her daughter, but she couldn't reach her. The tragedy of this case began long before letters arrived or investigative theories formed. It began with the loss of a child who loved soft toys, who believed her red jacket made her brave, who giggled when someone lifted her into the air, and who held tightly to her mother's hand because that was her safe place. To understand the depth of what was taken, we must first understand who she was. Before the forest, before the theories, before the world learned her name for the wrong reasons, Nyleen was not a mystery. She was a little girl, and this is where her story truly begins. Along Mopin Creek, the children raced each other through the grass. Nyleen followed them, just a few steps behind, until suddenly, she wasn't. After understanding the gentle, quiet world Nyleen came from, we return to the day everything changed. Saturday, June 25, 1983. The location was the vast and rugged Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, a place that stretched across mountains, creeks, and dense timber. Far from busy roads and city sounds, families often visited this area for peace, for fresh air, and for moments of connection away from the world. That day, a church group from Anaconda had gathered near Mopin Creek, a small, winding stretch of water, surrounded by tall pines and soft, uneven ground. The area was open enough for children to play, yet enclosed by the wild, quiet strength of the forest. Adults settled into their picnic spots, blankets, baskets, chatter, and a relaxed sense of familiarity. The setting felt safe. It was Montana. It was a community they trusted. It was nature, as they had always known it, gentle, predictable, peaceful. The children moved around freely, the way children do when adults feel comfortable. They chased one another through open patches of grass, followed trails worn down by previous hikers, and dipped their hands into the cool water of the creek. Nyleen, being younger and more timid than many of the others, stayed close to familiar faces. She did not run ahead. She did not wander far. She simply followed. At one point, 2 older children began walking along a narrow path that paralleled the creek. It was shaded, uneven, lined with trees, but visible enough from the picnic area that no one felt concern. Nyleen trailed behind them, not far, only a few steps, just enough for her small feet to keep pace. One of the children later said she was right there, within sight, close enough that they could hear her footsteps. And then, within moments, within less than half a minute, she was gone. The last confirmed moment Nyleen was seen was on that narrow trail, heading along Maupin Creek behind the older children. They turned a corner. She should have turned it too, but when they looked back, expecting to see her, they saw nothing. No movement, no shadow, no little red jacket she loved so much, just the quiet of the forest. Believing she had simply stopped or become distracted, the children returned to find her. They called her name. They checked the bushes. They listened for giggling the soft laugh they knew so well, but there was nothing. They returned to the adults, confused, expecting her to be with someone else. She was not. At first, the adults assumed she had followed a different group of children, that she had taken another path, that she would reappear in minutes. But minutes passed. Then more. And then, the tone shifted. Parents stood. Voices changed. A name was called more urgently. Nyleen. Adults began to search in widening circles. Picnic blankets were abandoned. Water bottles were dropped. People began walking faster, calling louder. Confusion turned into concern. Concern turned into fear. Fear turned into panic. The timeline of that moment remains haunting. First, she was right behind the children. Then she was out of sight for a handful of seconds. Then the trail was empty. The adults checked the creek bank. Nothing. They checked the wooded areas around the path. Nothing. They checked where the trail opened into a meadow. Nothing again. It was impossible, they thought. Children do not just disappear. Not in open daylight. Not in front of others. Not within seconds. But as the first hour passed, reality settled in. Something was very wrong. Parents split into searching groups. Some followed the creek downstream. Others moved uphill toward denser trees. Others retraced every step the children had taken earlier. Still, nothing. One mother from the picnic later said in a reenacted voiceover, "I remember thinking, she's 4. She couldn't have gone far. But the more we searched, the more the forest felt huge, like it was swallowing our voices before they could reach her." Another added, "The ground was soft. The creek was muddy. If she had walked anywhere, we should have seen prints. But there were none." What should have been a joyful church outing began turning into something no one present would ever forget. By the time word reached the authorities and official search teams were called in, the adults had already spent hours searching every reasonable place a small child could be. They found no path she could have taken, no sign of struggle, no clothing snagged on branches, no broken twigs that suggested a fall, no splash or disturbance in the creek. Nothing. It was the kind of disappearance that tore at logic, defied instinct, and left even experienced searchers unnerved. Because little children wander, they hide, they explore, they get distracted, but they do not vanish without leaving a trace. Yet that is exactly what happened along Maupin Creek that day. And the more investigators learned, the more unsettling the truth became. Because Nyleen's disappearance did not look like a child lost in the woods. It looked like something else entirely. For 2 weeks, helicopters circled above Maupin Creek, dogs tracked every trail, and volunteers scoured the ground inch by inch, yet not one physical trace of a 4-year-old girl was ever found. In the first minutes after realizing Nyleen was missing, Her parents and the adults from the church group believed they would find her quickly. Children wander. Children hide. Children play tricks. Most disappearances in the wilderness are resolved within minutes. But minutes turned into an hour, and an hour turned into something far more frightening. Nancy's voice grew hoarse from calling her daughter's name. Kirby ran back and forth along the creek, scanning the banks, calling, pleading, hoping for a tiny voice to answer him. Other parents joined, forming small search clusters, each taking a direction around the immediate campsite. Adults followed trails the children had explored earlier, climbed small ridges, checked behind rocks and fallen trees, and even stepped into the chilly waters of the creek, searching for any sign of movement. But the forest said nothing. By the time the first authorities were notified, the group had already searched as far as they believed a 4-year-old child could reasonably travel, and they expected the sheriff's deputies to find anything that they might have overlooked. But they didn't. Shortly after receiving the call, local officers mobilized a formal search response. Word spread quickly through Helena and Anaconda, and within hours, volunteers, forest rangers, deputies, and emergency responders were pouring into the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest. The terrain surrounding Maupin Creek is rugged and unforgiving. Dense timber, steep slopes, thick brush that snags clothing and leaves scratches visible on bare skin, uneven ground where even adults have to watch every step. It is not the kind of environment where a child moves silently. It is not the kind of terrain where footprints vanish. It is not the kind of landscape that hides a child without leaving signs. But somehow, that is exactly what happened. By the end of the first full day, search teams had extended their effort far beyond the immediate picnic area. They moved in widening grids, marking trees with bright flagging tape to track where they had already searched. Others followed the creek in both directions, testing areas where a child might have slipped or wandered. Nothing. On the second day, professional search and rescue crews arrived, equipped with radios, topographic maps, dogs, and aerial support. Helicopters hovered over the treetops, their engines echoing through the forest as spotters scanned for clothing, movement, or disturbed vegetation. Still nothing. The bloodhounds were brought in early, but even these trained dogs, animals capable of tracking hours-old scent through water, brush, or dust, struggled. One dog briefly indicated possible interest near a cluster of trees, but the scent trail evaporated almost instantly, disappearing the moment searchers tried to follow it. Handlers were baffled. Dogs do not simply lose the scent of a child that quickly unless the child is no longer on foot. Investigators began to take notice of the way the forest looked untouched. There were no drag marks, no torn fabric on branches, no small footprints in the damp soil near the creek, no signs of a struggle, no trace of panic or distress. It was as if she stepped off the path and dissolved into air. By day 3, the search had grown into one of the largest efforts Montana had seen at the time. Volunteers showed up by the dozens each morning. Some came from neighboring towns. Others drove hours from different parts of the state because they could not bear the thought of a missing 4-year-old in their own backyard. One volunteer later shared in a reenacted voiceover, "There were so many of us out there that the forest felt crowded. But even with all those feet on the ground, no one found a single clue. It made the whole thing feel unreal." Another added, "I've searched for lost hikers before. There is always something. Broken branches, tracks, clothing, something. But with Nyleen, it was like the forest refused to give her back." By the end of the first week, the search area had expanded dramatically. Search commanders estimated that crews had covered more than 20 square miles of forest surrounding the creek. Every trail, every ravine, every slope that a child could have climbed or fallen from. Nothing. Even the air felt strange, like a pressure hanging over the trees, tightening with each passing hour. Parents clung to hope, but hope became harder to hold when every direction turned up the same empty, confounding silence. As days passed, new strategies were introduced. Searchers formed tighter grid patterns. Some combed through tall grass on their hands and knees. Others used metal rods to gently probe the ground for signs of disturbed soil. Divers searched deeper parts of the creek. Aerial teams used infrared scanning from above. And still, Absolutely nothing. Investigators began to ask one another the same question. How does a 4-year-old child disappear in broad daylight, with other children nearby, without leaving a single trace behind? One sheriff's deputy later stated, "In all my years, I had never seen a case where the wilderness gave us nothing. Not a trail, not a scent, not a scrap of clothing. It was as though she walked into another world." The longer the search continued, the more the sense of dread grew. Families from the church group were exhausted, shaken, and overwhelmed by guilt, even though investigators made it clear no one had done anything wrong. The forest simply did not behave the way it should have. The evidence that should have been there was not. By the end of the 2-week mark, what began as a typical search and rescue had evolved into something darker. Something that no longer resembled a lost child scenario. Something that defied the logic of natural disappearance patterns. The lack of evidence suggested only 2 possibilities. Either Nyleen had somehow left the area in a way no search team could detect, or someone had taken her. And as investigators reviewed the statements from the children at the picnic, one detail began to surface again and again. A detail that would shift the entire investigation and open a door to a far more disturbing possibility. But that part of the story was still ahead. For now, all that remained was the silence of the forest, and the question that haunted everyone who searched for her. Where could a 4-year-old child go when there is nowhere left to hide? The children pointed toward the tree line. "A man was watching us," they said. "A stranger adults nearby never saw." As the search stretched into days, and investigators reviewed every statement from every witness present at Maupin Creek, one detail, small at first, almost dismissed, began rising to the surface with unsettling consistency. More than one child had reported seeing a man earlier that day. A man who did not belong to the church group. A man who stood among the trees, still and silent, watching them. It was not unusual for hikers to pass through the area. The Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest attracts campers, joggers, and travelers throughout the warmer months. But this man's behavior stood out, especially to children who were already attuned to their surroundings. They described him with surprising clarity for their age. He was wearing jogging clothes, light athletic wear, not the typical gear of a backpacker or a casual camper. He was alone. He did not speak. He did not wave. He simply watched. The children remembered that he stood partially behind a tree, as if trying not to be fully seen. They said they saw him before lunch, when they were playing near the creek, racing along the bank and gathering smooth stones from the water. But there was something else about their descriptions. Something investigators found deeply unsettling. Not one adult reported seeing him. Parents had been only yards away. Adults had walked along the trail throughout the morning. Church members had been chatting, unpacking food, and watching the children play. Yet somehow, the man seen by several children remained completely unseen by every adult present. When deputies interviewed the older children separately, the accounts remained consistent. They all described the same man, the same type of clothing, the same place where he had stood, the same feeling that he was watching them. One child said in a reenacted voiceover, "He was behind the trees, not far away. He didn't move." Another added, "We thought he was just someone walking, but he didn't walk. He just stayed there, looking at us." A third child said, "When we looked again, he was gone." Investigators immediately took note. This was not the description of a passerby. This was the description of someone observing, watching carefully, quietly, intentionally. The officers asked the children why they did not tell the adults at the time. Their answer was simple and heartbreaking. "We didn't know we should." To children, he had not seemed threatening, just strange, just different, just a quiet figure, standing where no one expected a stranger to be. When investigators brought this information to the adults, shock rippled through the group. Every parent, every teacher, every church member insisted they never saw any unfamiliar man. How could children see someone standing in the tree line, while adults, standing only a short distance away, saw no one at all? One parent in a reenacted voiceover said, "If a man had been watching the children, I swear we would have noticed him. We were right there. None of us saw anyone." And that is what made the detail so disturbing. If the man had been visible enough for children to notice, but invisible enough for adults to overlook, he was likely positioned with intention, hidden just enough, visible only from certain angles, watching the children, not the adults. The more investigators analyzed the statements, the more the theory of a simple lost child scenario began to crumble. A 4-year-old does not disappear silently in half a minute. A 4-year-old does not vanish without footprints, without scent, without a physical trace. A 4-year-old does not slip unnoticed into the woods while a dozen adults are within calling distance. But a 4-year-old could be taken, quickly, quietly, by someone who knew where to stand, when to move, and how to avoid drawing attention. The children's description of the man in jogging clothes shifted the investigation dramatically. What had begun as a search and rescue operation was now quietly transitioning into the possibility of an abduction. Investigators considered several possibilities. Had the man been watching the group all morning? Had he followed them into the area? Was he familiar with the terrain? Did he move closer when the children separated from the adults? Each question led to another, until the theory became a chilling possibility. The man may have waited for the exact moment when Nyleen lagged behind her friends. That small window of seconds when she was out of view from both children and adults, and taken her. That narrow stretch of trail along Maupin Creek provided the perfect opportunity. Trees on both sides, the sound of water masking footsteps, the natural dip in the path that momentarily blocked sightlines. Investigators returned to the area where children reported seeing the man. They walked the perimeter, stood behind the trees, tested visibility, checked angles, and they realized something that made their blood run cold. From where the man stood, he could see the children, but the adults could not see him, not unless they walked several yards to the left, or turned their heads at precisely the right moment. He had chosen his place carefully. That realization marked the turning point in the investigation. The search was no longer just about finding a missing girl. It was about finding a man who may have taken her. And investigators now had to confront a terrifying truth. If the man in jogging clothes had anything to do with Nyleen's disappearance, he had done it with skill, speed, and planning. He would not have left footprints. He would not have left clothing behind. He would not have lingered. He would have taken her and vanished, as silently as she did. And soon, investigators would receive something even more chilling. Something that suggested the man did far more than just watch. Letters, typed letters, from a man who claimed to have her, but that part of the story was only beginning. The letter writer claimed he fed her, bathed her, traveled with her, and that she clung to him, calling him Daddy. But investigators froze when they noticed he referenced private details never released to the public. Years passed after the day Nyleen vanished along Maupin Creek. Years of searching, hoping, pleading, praying. Years of tips that went nowhere, theories that fell apart, and leads that dissolved before investigators could even follow them. And then, out of nowhere, the case came roaring back to life. In the late 1980s, Child Find of America, a national organization dedicated to locating missing children, began receiving typed letters from an anonymous man. The letters were disturbing, intimate, and shockingly detailed. The writer claimed he had abducted Nyleen. He insisted she was still alive. He said she had been living with him ever since the day she disappeared. In the first letter, he wrote, "I took her from the forest." But what followed made investigators go still. He said she called him Daddy, not Sir, not Mr., but Daddy, a word that belonged to someone else, a word that struck at the heart of the case, slicing through the hope that she had simply wandered off. He described their life together as if it were normal, as if it were something to be proud of. He said he fed her, bathed her, clothed her, and took her with him wherever he traveled. The writer claimed they had moved across the United States, then into Mexico, and later to Canada. He described staying in hotels, cabins, and private homes. He said he taught her to speak softly to avoid attention. He said she slept close to him at night, resting her head against his shoulder. His tone was horrifying, not because it was frantic or angry, but because it was calm, controlled, matter of fact. He believed what he was saying, or he wanted them to believe it. Then came the part investigators dreaded most, the part the public rarely hears about. The man described sexual acts involving the child. In respectful narration, We do not repeat the content. But the important fact is this. The details were explicit enough to show the writer understood the psychology and behavior of child predators. To law enforcement, this was not the work of a teenager seeking attention. This was not a prank. This was not something invented on a whim. This was the writing of someone with experience in harm. But it was the other parts of the letter, the quieter details, that alarmed the FBI even more. The writer described aspects of the day of her disappearance that had never been released publicly. Details about the layout of the creek. Details about where the children had been playing. Details about her clothing. Details about her personality. Small facts, minor, almost forgettable, that investigators had intentionally kept hidden so they could identify real leads from false ones. Yet this man knew them. In one letter, he described Nyleen as being shy and delicate. Her family had used those exact words in private interviews with law enforcement, but never in any press release. He wrote about lifting her into his arms. He wrote about how she reacted when frightened. He referenced a small mannerism only someone close to her would know. Each detail added weight. Each sentence tightened the knot in investigators' stomachs. Because either this man truly did abduct her, or he knew more about the case than anyone realized. But the letters were only the beginning. Child Find also received phone calls, brief, steady-voiced, unemotional calls from a man claiming he had written the letters. The calls were traced to payphones in Wisconsin, including several in Madison. Call after call came from different locations, never the same booth twice. He never stayed on long. He never raised his voice. He never hesitated. His tone was flat and cold. The kind of voice that chills investigators because it reveals nothing. The FBI traced the calls, interviewed dozens of people who had been near the booths at the time, even canvassed the areas for anyone who might have seen a man lingering nearby. But they found nothing. The caller always left before anyone could reach him. One agent later said in a reenacted voiceover, "It was like chasing smoke. By the time we got to the payphone, he had already vanished." The man's letters continued sporadically, each one reinforcing the same horrific narrative. He had her. She was with him. She depended on him. And she called him Daddy. Investigators were torn. On one hand, the letters were filled with disturbing sexual language, the kind commonly used by offenders who fantasize about child abduction rather than commit it. On the other hand, he knew things he should not have known. Things even journalists covering the case did not know. Things the public never heard. Things that were only documented in private interviews and internal reports. This split the possibility of a deranged fantasist versus the possibility of a real abductor made it nearly impossible for investigators to determine how seriously to take the man's claims. Complicating matters further, some experts believe the writer's psychological profile aligned with offenders who abduct for long-term control rather than immediate violence. But others believe the writer fabricated parts of the story to attach himself to the case, feeding on media attention and the suffering of a grieving family. The truth was lost somewhere between those two extremes. And as the letters continued, the investigation began shifting once more, from a case defined by silence and absence to a case haunted by a voice that came from nowhere and left investigators chasing shadows across 3 countries. Yet for all the words the man wrote, for all the clues he dropped, and for all the pain he caused, one question refused to fade. Was he telling the truth? Or was he hiding behind the tragedy of a little girl who vanished in a forest one summer afternoon? Investigators could not answer, and Nyleen remained missing. But the letters were about to lead detectives down new paths. Paths filled with hope, disappointment, and revelations that would fracture the case even further. The FBI traced every letter, every call, every whisper of information, but every path crumbled into dust before they could take a second step. When the anonymous letters reached Child Find of America and the phone calls were traced to Wisconsin, the Federal Bureau of Investigation formally stepped into Nyleen's case. What had once been a local tragedy now carried the weight of a federal investigation, complete with analysts, profilers, handwriting experts, and field agents, determined to break through the darkness surrounding her disappearance. The first priority was the letters. FBI handwriting specialists examined every stroke, spacing, and mechanical pattern of the typed pages. They studied the language, the rhythm of his sentences, the emotional tone, and the strange mixture of affection and control. But because the letters were typed, there were no pen pressure signatures, no handwriting quirks, no tangible traits that could identify the man behind them. Typed letters are designed to erase identity. And in this case, they succeeded. Phone calls were their next focus. Agents attempted to trace each call that came through to Child Find, tracking them back to payphones scattered around Madison, Wisconsin, and surrounding areas. They canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed store clerks, gas station attendants, restaurant workers, anyone who might have seen a man lingering near a payphone around the time of the calls. But the caller never stayed long. By the time agents arrived, he was gone. Each location became another empty space, another dead lead. One agent later said, "We were always minutes too late. It was like he knew exactly how much time he had before we got there." With letters and calls yielding nothing concrete, the FBI turned to behavioral analysis. Profilers studied the tone of the messages, the sexual descriptions, the level of confidence, the strange calmness with which he described traveling with a child he claimed to have abducted. Some believed he could be a seasoned offender, older, intelligent, familiar with law enforcement tactics, weaving himself into the case without ever having touched the child. The internal debate made progress difficult. Every theory seemed possible, and none could be proven. Agents also explored the idea that the writer might live in Wisconsin or travel through it frequently, given the repeated use of payphones in the same region. Dozens of interviews were conducted, suspects were questioned, some more than once, but every time agents believed they had found someone promising, the lead collapsed. One man had the right psychological profile but airtight alibis. Another lived near a payphone used by the caller but had no connection to children. A third seemed suspicious, but handwriting samples proved useless because the letters were typed. Every road the FBI followed split into nothing. Yet each new letter, each new call, sparked a brief flare of hope. Hope that the long silence was about to break. But just as quickly as hope appeared, it disappeared. By the late 1980s, the investigators were left with only two truths. The letter writer had never been identified, and Nyleen had never been found. The case remained open, alive, but suffocating under the weight of unanswered questions. And soon, the mystery would take another turn, one filled with theories that would divide investigators for decades. With no body, no belongings, no confirmed suspect, and no verified letter writer, investigators were forced to build entire theories from fragments. And over the years, those fragments shaped three major possibilities, each unsettling, each incomplete, each impossible to prove or dismiss. The first theory: the letter writer really abducted her. This is the theory that terrifies people the most. It is also the theory the public remembers most clearly. If the anonymous man told the truth, then 4-year-old Nyleen was not simply taken. She was raised by her abductor. According to his letters, he traveled with her across the United States, then into Mexico, and later into Canada. He claimed she called him Daddy. He insisted she was alive and dependent on him. He described caring for her, feeding her, bathing her, teaching her to remain quiet in public places. Chillingly, he claimed she slept beside him at night, clinging to him for warmth. Investigators took this theory seriously for several reasons. The writer described private details never released publicly. Some of his statements matched psychological patterns of long-term child abduction offenders. His letters reflected knowledge of law enforcement procedures and how to avoid capture. His tone suggested familiarity with grooming behaviors. But the largest reason this theory holds weight is simple. There is no evidence that Nyleen died in the forest. None. Not a footprint, not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a trace. And the forest was searched thoroughly, far more thoroughly than most missing child cases ever are. If she did not die in those woods, then someone may have taken her. And the only person who ever claimed to have done so was the man behind the letters. The second theory: the letter writer was a hoaxer, but Nyleen was still abducted. This theory emerged because investigators know that high-profile missing child cases often attract disturbed individuals who insert themselves into the narrative. Hoax letters are not unusual. Many law enforcement officers believe the man who wrote to Child Find may have been one of these individuals. someone who wanted attention, someone who enjoyed the power of manipulating grief, someone who studied the case long enough to fabricate believable details, someone who had no actual connection to Nyleen. But even if the letter writer was a hoaxer, that does not solve the case, because the circumstances of Nyleen's disappearance still strongly suggest abduction. The vanished footprints, the children's account of a man in jogging clothes watching them, the short time window between being seen and being discovered missing, the lack of physical evidence in any direction, those details do not fit the profile of a child simply wandering off. They fit the profile of a child being taken quickly and quietly. So even if the letter writer was lying, someone else may have abducted her. This theory leaves investigators frustrated. It provides the possibility of abduction without providing the identity of an abductor. It creates a door, but no one knows what is on the other side. The third theory. She wandered into the wilderness and died. Least supported. This is the theory investigators considered early in the search, but quickly found difficult to support. Yes, children wander. Yes, Montana wilderness can be unforgiving. Yes, accidents happen, but the evidence contradicts this scenario. There were no footprints leading away from the trail. Bloodhounds never picked up a scent. The search covered more than 20 square miles. Helicopters scanned from above for days. No animal attack traces were found. No clothing, bones, or personal items were ever discovered. For a child to wander deep enough into the wilderness to never be found, she would have needed time, and Nyleen had only seconds. This theory is generally considered the weakest. Not impossible, but highly improbable. But here's why none of the theories can be proven. Every theory has evidence. Every theory has holes. There is no body, no confirmed suspect, no verified letter writer, no physical trace whatsoever. The case exists in a space of contradiction. Too many clues to dismiss foul play, too few to confirm anything, and that uncertainty is its own form of torment. For Nancy and Kirby, the theories were not academic exercises. They were not puzzles to be solved. They were lifelines, and also weapons. Each theory offered hope and stole it away. Each possibility suggested an answer, and yet none could be proven. In interviews, Nancy often spoke of living in two worlds, one where her daughter might still be alive, and another where she might not. But because there was no evidence of death, she held on to the only choice a mother could make, the choice to believe her child might still be somewhere in the world, waiting to be found. And that hope, fragile but enduring, is what kept the case alive. For the first time in years, hope flickered. But just as quickly, DNA testing extinguished it. As the 1990s unfolded, the case of Nyleen Kay Marshall drifted between cold case files and occasional investigative reviews. Leads still trickled in sightings, rumors, supposed confessions, but none held weight. None offered clarity. None stayed solid long enough to follow. And then came something different. Something that made investigators sit up. Something that made Child Find of America move quickly, very quickly. It began overseas. A young woman living far from Montana, far from the forest where Nyleen vanished, far from anything connected to the case, appeared in the public eye. She was close in age to what Nyleen would have been at that time, and she resembled her. Not vaguely, not in the way strangers sometimes do, but enough that when her photograph reached Child Find, the resemblance sparked immediate interest. Her facial structure matched. Her eyes carried the same softness. Her expression, the same gentle, timid quality described by Nyleen's family, was uncanny. Child Find had reviewed countless supposed matches over the years. They had grown familiar with disappointment. But this one was different. The organization reached out quietly, cautiously. They contacted the young woman, presented the possibility to her, explained the case, and asked to learn more about her background. She cooperated. Willingly, openly, curiously. She wanted to know if she really could be the missing girl taken from a Montana forest so many years earlier. Investigators requested basic personal history, childhood information, early records, photographs, anything that could confirm or contradict her origins. But her story contained gaps, pieces that did not align perfectly, loose ends that raised questions. Enough questions, in fact, that a serious evaluation began. The young woman agreed to provide a DNA sample. For the first time in many years, Nyleen's mother, Nyleen Kay, felt something stir inside her. A feeling she had buried under grief and unanswered questions. A feeling she had protected herself from. Hope. In interviews, Nancy explained the emotional tension that comes with such moments. Hope is a dangerous thing for a mother who has lost a child. It can lift her to heights she fears and crash her back into the very same darkness she fights every day. But she allowed herself to feel it just a little. Investigators arranged the DNA process, coordinating with international agencies. Every step was handled with care. Every detail double-checked. This was not merely a lead. This was a possibility. The kind of possibility that could rewrite the story. The kind that could bring a mother answers. The kind that could turn decades of pain into a long-awaited reunion. The waiting period was agonizing. Child Find remained cautiously optimistic. Federal investigators monitored developments. Nancy waited in quiet hope. Local communities who remembered the case followed updates with prayers and trembling anticipation. A world that had lived with the unanswered mystery for so long held its breath. And then, the results arrived. The young woman was not Nyleen. The genetic markers did not match. There was no biological connection to Nancy or Kirby. The resemblance, though striking, was only coincidence. The news landed like a stone dropped into still water, heavy, sudden, irreversible. The ripples carried disappointment, heartbreak, and the familiar ache of another false ending. Nancy later said the result felt like losing her daughter all over again. Not because she truly believed the young woman was Nyleen, but because for the first time in years, she had allowed herself to imagine the possibility. Investigators, though disheartened, were not surprised. The number of lookalikes in missing person cases is higher than most people realize. But each time one appears, families are pulled into an emotional storm. A storm built on hope, fear, and longing. Still, despite the result, something important came from the experience. It proved that people across the world were paying attention. It showed that the case still lived in public memory, still traveled through communities, still held the power to inspire people to step forward. But emotionally, the overseas false identification left a scar. Nancy returned to waiting. Investigators returned to their files. Child Find returned to reviewing new submissions. And the young woman went back to her own life, carrying with her the knowledge that for a moment she might have been someone else's lost child. In the end, the case remained exactly where it had been. Open, unresolved, unanswered. But something had changed. The hope that flickered then died reminded the world just how deeply this case still hurt, how profoundly one disappearance could echo through decades, and how fragile the line between possibility and heartbreak can be. A case without evidence of death is, in many ways, a case that refuses to die. As the years turned into decades, the disappearance of 4-year-old Nyleen Kay Marshall did not fade the way most cold cases do. In fact, the older the case became, the more questions investigators found themselves asking. Technology changed. Profiling methods advanced. Entire fields of forensic science evolved. And with each shift, detectives revisited Nyleen's file with fresh eyes. One of the most impactful developments came through age progression imaging. Investigators worked with forensic artists to create carefully crafted renderings of what Nyleen might look like at various ages, 10, 15, 20, 25, and beyond. These images, released periodically to the public, carried a soft ache with them. In the drawings, her eyes always remained gentle, her expression shy, her face maturing, while retaining the same innocence she carried at 4 years old. Each image was a reminder not just of who she had been, but who she might have become. The age-progressed photos circulated across the country and internationally, appearing in missing person newsletters, online bulletins, and law enforcement databases. They brought new leads, new sightings, new moments of hope. None were ever confirmed, but each one carried the same message. There is still no evidence she has died, and that alone keeps the possibility of her survival alive. Cold case detectives have spent years re-evaluating the anonymous letters that once shocked investigators and the public. With modern techniques, linguistic analysis software, and updated offender profiling. Experts have re-examined the tone, structure, phrasing, and psychological markers embedded in the messages. Some of the findings were chilling. Patterns in the letters matched known offender behavior in long-term child abduction cases, particularly cases involving grooming, dependency, creation, and isolation. The writer described movements across the United States, into Mexico, and then into Canada. Investigators now know these routes align with documented trafficking pathways used by offenders who seek border regions to avoid detection. He used possessive language that reflected obsession, not spontaneity. He alternated between affection and control. He described teaching her to remain quiet in public language, consistent with grooming tactics observed in abduction cases that lasted years or even decades. Even though the FBI was never able to confirm the writer's identity, modern analysts agree that some aspects of his communication were too detailed and too accurate to dismiss entirely. There remains the uncomfortable possibility that the man was not lying, and that possibility continues to haunt investigators. In reviewing modern child abduction cases, detectives noted parallels between Nyleen's disappearance and cases where children were taken quickly and silently in outdoor environments. Many of those children were moved by vehicle within minutes, leaving no tracks, no scent, no trace. An outcome that once seemed impossible in Nyleen's case, but is now understood as disturbingly achievable. The terrain where she vanished, steep and uneven but adjacent to areas where a vehicle could have been concealed, is now seen as more vulnerable than investigators realized in 1983. Modern understanding of trafficking networks, transient offenders, and long-term captivity cases has broadened investigative perspectives. Children have been recovered alive after years, sometimes decades, of being hidden, moved, or renamed. This evolution in knowledge changed how detectives interpret Nyleen's file. Her disappearance does not resemble typical wandering deaths. It does not resemble accidental drownings. It does not reflect animal attacks. It does not match the patterns of children who get lost in wilderness environments. But it does match certain elements seen in targeted abductions. Cold case investigators have said repeatedly that the file feels unfinished, as though whatever happened to her is still connected to someone alive today. The anonymous letter continues to be a focal point of debate. Some experts believe it was the work of a disturbed man seeking attention. Others believe it was the confession of her abductor, written in a moment of twisted pride. Both interpretations hold merit. Neither can be proven. What troubles investigators most is this. If the letter writer fabricated everything, how did he know private investigative details? How did he describe her behavior so accurately? How did he reproduce elements of the disappearance never shared with the public? The absence of answers is not neutral. It suggests that someone, somewhere, either knew far more than they should have or had direct access to Nyleen after she vanished. And so, the case remains open, not out of obligation, not out of sentiment, but because it is structurally impossible to close. There is no confirmed suspect. There is no confirmed death. There is no confirmed hoax. There is no confirmed abduction. There is only a child who vanished without a trace, and a trail of clues that point in many directions, yet refuse to land in any single, provable place. And that is why detectives old and new still revisit her file. Why age-progressed images continue to be released. Why her name still circulates through law enforcement networks. Because a case without evidence of death remains, in the eyes of investigators, a case of possibility. And possibility, however faint, is the one thing that keeps Nyleen's story alive. For years, Nancy kept Nyleen's bedroom untouched, as if waiting for the sound of small footsteps returning home. As time moved forward and the world continued on its inevitable course, one person remained anchored in the moment her daughter vanished. Nancy Marshall, later known as Nancy Kay, after her remarriage. But no matter what name she carried, her emotional identity never changed. She was, and always would be, Nyleen's mother. Her journey through the decades is not a straight line. It is a series of circles, loops of hope, despair, denial, acceptance, and then hope again. Because without answers, grief becomes something that does not end. It reshapes itself. It becomes a lifetime companion. In the early years, Nancy spent every waking moment advocating for her daughter. She worked with authorities, with Child Find of America, with local law enforcement, and with national organizations that specialized in missing children. She gave interviews. She stood in front of cameras. She allowed herself to cry publicly, even when she wished she could remain strong. Her pleas were always gentle, always heartbreaking. If you have her, please let her come home. I will never stop looking for my little girl. Someone knows something. Please say it. There was never anger in her voice, only aching longing. Only a mother begging the world to remember her child. As the years turned into decades, Nancy's life divided itself into two realities. There was the normal world work, responsibilities, family, routine, and then there was the quiet world inside her mind, where she replayed the same questions over and over. Where did my daughter go? Is she alive? Is she safe? Does she remember me? Does she know I'm still waiting? Those questions lived inside her. They shaped her days. They shaped her nights. They shaped the way she moved through the world, never fully present, always partially anchored to a forest in Montana where her life had split in two. She kept Nyleen's belongings carefully preserved. Her toys, her clothes, her small, gentle treasures. Some mothers of missing children pack these things away to survive the pain. Nancy could not. She left them as they were, as if freezing time might somehow preserve the possibility of her daughter's return. Friends who visited her home years later recalled seeing Nyleen's belongings exactly where they had been on the day she disappeared. A tiny sweater folded neatly, a stuffed rabbit resting on the bed, photographs placed carefully on shelves, pictures of a child frozen forever at 4 years old. Even as the world aged around her, the emotional toll was immense. Unresolved grief is not a wound. It is an open door through which pain enters again and again. It shapes a mother's smile, making it softer but sadder. It shapes her speech, slowing it slightly, giving each word more weight. It shapes her decisions, small and large, because every choice is made in a life where something vital is missing. Nancy remarried, but love never erased the ache. It simply existed beside it. Her community, especially those from Anaconda and surrounding Montana towns, remained fiercely supportive. For years, church groups held prayer circles, neighbors offered help, local newspapers revisited the case, and volunteers continued to share her missing posters every time age-progressed images were released. There was heartbreak too, because a community that watches a child vanish without answers carries its own shared grief. Many of them still remember where they were when they learned Nyleen had disappeared. Many still remember the helplessness of not being able to find her. Many still cannot accept how a forest so familiar could swallow a child so completely. Nancy's public involvement in the case waxed and waned depending on her emotional strength. Sometimes she gave interviews. Sometimes she backed away from the media. Sometimes she worked quietly with investigators. Sometimes she allowed herself space to breathe, to find pieces of peace where she could. But one thing never changed. She never stopped waiting. Her statements across the years remained consistent, unwavering, and filled with a mother's everlasting determination. If she is alive, I want her to know I never stopped loving her. I believe she might still be out there. I just want to know what happened to my baby. These were not the words of a woman living in denial. They were the words of a mother living in uncertainty, a deeper, sharper form of pain than loss itself. Grief has a conclusion. Uncertainty does not. And that uncertainty shaped the rest of Nancy's life. It shaped her choices, her memories, her voice, and her heart. It shaped every day that followed the moment her daughter stepped into the shadowed tree line and never returned. But above all, it shaped her resolve. Because as long as there was no evidence of death, there was still reason to hope. A mother's hope is not fragile. It is not unreasonable. It is not naive. It is faithful. It is powerful. It is enduring. And, in Nancy's case, it is eternal. Some cases fade with time. Nyleen's never has. Because somewhere out there, the truth is still alive. 4-year-old children do not simply vanish. Forests do not erase footprints. Trails do not swallow people whole. And letters do not contain private details unless someone knows more than they should. This case has existed for decades inside a strange, painful space. A space where questions multiply faster than answers, where certainty disappears the moment you reach for it, and where every theory remains suspended just beyond reach. The unanswered questions linger like shadows along Maupin Creek. Who was the man the children saw in jogging clothes? Why did adults overlook him completely? Was he simply a passerby? Or was he standing there for a reason? How did Nyleen disappear in less than half a minute? Why was there no cry for help, no sound, no struggle? If she wandered, why were there no footprints? If she fell, why was there no disturbance in the brush or the water? And the letters? The letters that arrived years later from a man who claimed she lived with him, traveled with him, depended on him, called him Daddy. Were they real? A hoax? Something in between? The man described intimate details of the day she vanished. Details the public never knew. How did he know them? Was he involved in the disappearance? Or did he somehow gain access to confidential information? And what about the payphone calls traced to Wisconsin? How did the caller always stay ahead of investigators? How did he slip away every time, leaving nothing but a dial tone and an unease that lingered long after the line went dead? The forest holds its own unanswered questions. It gave up no clothing, no scent trail, no belongings, not even a single disturbed branch. Searchers walked more than 20 square miles, scanning every inch of ground with a desperation that still haunts many of them today. But the forest remained silent, cold, still, as if whatever happened there was removed before the land could react. And then there is the most haunting question of all. Could she still be alive? In some missing child cases, survival becomes impossible to imagine. Time erases the hope. Evidence confirms the worst. Families grieve, heal, and eventually rebuild their lives. But Nyleen's case is different. There is no evidence of death, no confirmed abductor, no confirmed hoaxer, no confirmed anything. Just a child who vanished, and a mystery that refuses to settle. Age progression photos show a young woman who might exist somewhere. Someone with soft eyes and a shy expression. Someone who might look into a mirror and wonder why parts of her past feel unreachable. Cold case investigators do not close her file because, in their words, there is nothing to close. A case without a body is a case with possibility. A case without an end is a case that still breathes. And so, every few years, the image of Nyleen resurfaces. New detectives revisit the letters. New forensic technologies are applied. New leads are examined. New hopes rise, even if briefly. Because until the truth is known, until the final thread is tied to something solid, Nyleen remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American true crime. A little girl who vanished from a Montana forest and left a question mark that spans decades. Somewhere out there, someone knows what happened. Somewhere out there, the truth still waits. And perhaps, somewhere out there, she might still be alive. In 2, it's 10. If you appreciate careful, respectful deep dive true crime investigations, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Crimes Unsealed. Your engagement helps keep these long-forgotten cases alive and helps bring stories like this back into the light.